Martell thought he had every move figured out. For weeks, he'd been carefully, almost obsessively, crafting a comeback that would silence his critics and remind everyone why his name carried weight in Huntsville. He wasn't broadcasting it. This wasn't the loud, attention-grabbing Martell of the past. This was a quieter, more calculating version. Meetings were happening behind closed doors. Calls were being made at odd hours. Every appearance was measured. To the casual eye, it looked like he was simply living life. But to those paying closer attention, the pieces were being placed with precision. Martell believed that when the time was right, everything would align perfectly. The plan relied on control. Control over the narrative. Control over his relationships, and control over how the public would see him. And for a while, it seemed to be working. He was avoiding unnecessary drama, smiling in the right places, keeping conversations light. The man who once couldn't help but react was now practicing patience.
Past, she can't see all the great stuff that I'm doing in the present. And I feel that being the father of her 4 children, she should want to be on a better page. She should want what's best for all of us. Instead of just being so nitpicky and focus on all these small little things that happen so long.
But plans like Martell's only work when the variables stay in line. And that's where everything began to unravel. Melody's return was the first unexpected variable, and it was the one that shook him the most. She had been living her own life, staying focused on her children, her career, and her peace. For Martell, that meant less friction, less overlap, and less threat to the image he was building. But the moment Melody stepped back into spaces they once shared, the air changed. It wasn't just her presence, it was the way people's attention shifted when she walked in. The way conversations naturally drifted toward her projects, her resilience, and the life she had built since leaving Martell behind. For Martell, this was more than inconvenient. Melody carried with her the weight of history, the reminder of decisions he made that couldn't be undone. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, her presence forced comparisons between who he was then and who he claimed to be now. Every time she smiled confidently, every time she spoke with calm authority, it silently challenged his version of events. Then came the second variable, Arionne. For years, she had been a constant in Martell's orbit. Their connection had been messy, complicated, and, at times, destructive. But through it all, Martell seemed to believe that when he needed her to, Arionne would stand by him. Maybe she wouldn't always agree, maybe she'd have her frustrations, but in the end, she'd play her part. Except this time, she didn't. When Martell approached her about a role in his new plan, Arionne's response was quick, sharp, and final. She wasn't going to be positioned for his convenience. She wasn't going to keep waiting for promises that never materialized. And she wasn't going to stand in the wings while his attention shifted elsewhere, especially if that elsewhere was in any way connected to Melody. Her no wasn't just a refusal, it was a declaration that the rules had changed. And for Martell, it was a dangerous crack in the foundation he'd been building. Without Arionne's cooperation, certain pieces of his plan didn't fit anymore. There were appearances he could no longer make, conversations that fell flat, and moments that now carried an awkward, unspoken tension. In public, Martell tried to keep the image intact. The smile stayed in place, the words remained polished, but in private, there were signs of strain. The patience he'd been practicing began to slip. Friends noticed his calls becoming more urgent, his tone more clipped, even his body language, the way his jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned, hinted at the frustration building under the surface. Melody, meanwhile, wasn't going out of her way to disrupt Martell's plan. But she also wasn't shrinking to make it easier for him. She moved with deliberate confidence, connecting with people who supported her, working on ventures that spoke to her independence, and showing a quiet joy that seemed immune to the surrounding drama. Without even trying, she was becoming the center of the conversation again. For Martell, this created a subtle but dangerous shift. His appearances began to feel reactive, almost as if he were responding to Melody's moves instead of leading the narrative. And when Arionne remained absent from key moments, it became impossible for people not to notice. In a town like Huntsville, silence can be louder than words. The tension reached a new level at a private gathering Martell had counted on as a way to solidify his standing. He arrived dressed to impress, speaking with practiced charm. But as the night went on, conversations kept circling back to Melody, her latest projects, her energy, the way she seemed unbothered by the storm. Martell tried to redirect the topics, but the undercurrent was clear. The focus had shifted, and he was no longer the one controlling it. Arionne's absence that night was impossible to ignore. Those who knew the backstory didn't need an explanation. And those who didn't were quietly filled in by people eager to share the new reality that Arionne wasn't just keeping her distance. She was making a statement by doing so. What Martell hadn't fully realized until now was that his plan wasn't collapsing in one big public explosion. It was slowly breaking apart in small, precise fractures. A look exchanged here, a conversation cut short there, a seat left empty at an event, and the damage from these small fractures was harder to fix, because they weren't dramatic enough to spin. They were subtle enough to be real. Melody's quiet strength kept amplifying the contrast between her and Martell, where he was visibly adjusting to unexpected problems. She appeared steady, unshaken, and in control of her own path. And the more people saw that, the more they began to wonder if Martell's carefully crafted image was really as solid as he wanted it to be. It was about control over how he was seen, control over the narrative, and control over the people connected to him. But when Melody returned, she brought with her a reminder of a time when Martell didn't have the final say, and when Arionne refused to play her part. She proved that his influence over her had limits he hadn't acknowledged. This combination created a perfect storm. Martell began making moves that seemed reactive rather than calculated. He'd appear somewhere unplanned, almost as if to counter something Melody had done. He'd drop a statement that felt aimed more at Arionne than at the public. Each action seemed like a patch over a deeper fracture, and those who knew him best could see that the man who once prided himself on staying 2 steps ahead was now chasing the game instead of leading it. Melody wasn't necessarily trying to break Martell's plan apart, but her mere presence did exactly that. She'd been through the public drama before, and she wasn't interested in repeating it. But she also wasn't going to shrink herself to make Martell more comfortable. And as she moved forward with quiet strength, the contrast between her steady confidence and his increasingly scattered decisions only grew sharper. Meanwhile, Arionne seemed to be entering a new phase of her own. No longer waiting for Martell's attention, she started making decisions that put her own interests first, and those decisions didn't align with what Martell wanted. For someone used to having people bend to his will, it was a wake-up call, whether he admitted it or not. Arionne's no wasn't just about one specific request. It was about years of imbalance finally tipping the other way. By the time Martell realized the full scope of the problem, it was too late too quietly. Fix it. Arionne, too, was making moves that didn't involve Martell, choices that centered her own well-being rather than his agenda. She was setting boundaries, and for someone like Martell, who had grown used to influencing her decisions, it was a wake-up call. He wasn't just losing control of a plan, he was losing influence over 2 of the most significant women in his life. By the time Martell grasped the full scope of the problem, the momentum had already shifted. Melody had re-established herself as an independent force. Arionne had stepped out of his shadow entirely, and Martell was left in the middle, holding on to a plan that no longer matched the reality in front of him. In Huntsville, perception is everything. And right now, the perception was that Martell wasn't leading the story, he was reacting to it. What was supposed to be a perfectly executed return had turned into a test of adaptability, and the cracks in his approach were visible for everyone to see. The truth is, Martell's secret plan didn't fail because of one dramatic moment. It failed because the 2 people he'd assumed would play predictable roles refused to do so. Melody's return reminded the world that she didn't need him to thrive. Arionne's no reminded him that his influence had limits, and together, those 2 truths dismantled the control he had worked so hard to regain. Now, the real question is what Martell will do next. Will he adapt, rebuild, and find a way forward that doesn't depend on controlling others? Or will he keep trying to pull strings that are no longer connected to him? Because in this new reality, the board has shifted and Martell isn't the only one making moves anymore. Sometimes the most devastating defeats aren't the ones that happen in public, but the ones that happen quietly, in the background, while you're still smiling for the cameras. And if Martell isn't careful, this quiet unraveling might not just mark the end of his plan. It could be the moment his story starts being written without him at all.